The sound of their laughter still echoes in my bones, a hollow, mocking symphony that began the moment I walked into my own 21st birthday party. My parents, Margaret and Richard Blackwood, stood before a room full of family friends, their faces twisted with that particular brand of cruelty that masquerades as humor, and delivered the words that would shatter whatever remained of my naive hope for their love. "You don't even deserve a birthday, Stella. You're nothing but a failure." The party guests, neighbors, colleagues, distant relatives, erupted into uncomfortable chuckles, their eyes darting between my parents and me, unsure whether this was some elaborate family joke or a genuine display of parental contempt. I felt my chest constrict, as if invisible hands were squeezing the air from my lungs, but I forced my lips into that practiced smile I'd perfected over 21 years of disappointment. The living room felt suffocating, despite its spacious dimensions, decorated with generic birthday supplies that screamed of last-minute obligation rather than celebration. Balloons hung limply from the ceiling, like deflated dreams, their bright colors a stark contrast to the darkness settling over my heart. My mother's perfectly manicured fingers gestured dismissively in my direction as she continued her performance for the crowd, her voice dripping with false sweetness as she regaled them with stories of my supposed inadequacies, how I'd failed to get into the prestigious university they'd chosen, how my job at the local bookstore was beneath their family's standards, how I'd never lived up to the promise they saw in my older brother Marcus. Each word was a precisely aimed arrow, designed to wound while maintaining the veneer of maternal disappointment rather than outright abuse. The guests' expressions began to shift as the minutes dragged on, their initial amusement giving way to visible discomfort as they realized this wasn't playful family banter, but something far more sinister. Mrs. Henderson from next door cleared her throat awkwardly and glanced toward the door, while Uncle James studied his wine glass with sudden fascination, unable to meet my eyes. I could feel their pity radiating toward me in waves, and somehow that felt worse than my parents' cruelty. The knowledge that these people could see my humiliation, could witness my parents' systematic destruction of my self-worth, and yet they would do nothing but whisper about it later over dinner tables and coffee cups. The weight of their silent judgment pressed down on me, adding another layer to the suffocating atmosphere that had defined every significant moment of my life. But beneath the familiar ache of rejection, something new was stirring, a cold, determined fury that had been building for months, carefully hidden behind my practiced mask of compliance and gratitude. Tonight was supposed to be different. I had promised myself that much. Tonight, I would finally show them exactly what their daughter was capable of, what 21 years of their contempt had forged in the hidden depths of my soul. As I stood there absorbing their mockery, I felt my hand slip into my jacket pocket, fingers closing around the small wrapped package I had prepared with such meticulous care, and I allowed myself a genuine smile for the first time in years. They thought they knew me, thought they had broken me completely, but they were about to discover just how wrong they had been about their failure of a daughter. The memories came flooding back as I stood in that room, each one a sharp reminder of how I'd arrived at this moment of reckoning. I was 7 years old again, standing in the kitchen doorway watching my mother prepare breakfast for Marcus while completely ignoring my presence, her face lighting up with genuine warmth as she asked him about his dreams from the night before. When I had tried to join the conversation, sharing my own vivid dream about flying over our neighborhood, she had looked at me with that familiar expression of mild annoyance and told me to go get dressed for school. No interest, no follow-up questions, just dismissal wrapped in the guise of maternal efficiency. Even then, I had felt the sting of being invisible in my own home, of existing on the periphery of a family that seemed complete without me, but I had attributed it to normal parental favoritism rather than the systematic emotional abandonment it truly was. School had been my refuge in those early years, a place where teachers actually listened when I spoke, where my artwork was hung on bulletin boards and my essays were read aloud to the class. Mrs. Patterson, my third-grade teacher, had even called my parents for a conference to discuss my exceptional writing abilities, suggesting I be enrolled in the gifted program that would challenge my clearly advanced intellect. I had been so excited, rushing home with dreams of finally making my parents proud, of proving that I was worthy of their attention and love. But when the evening of the parent-teacher conference arrived, my father had looked at his watch with exaggerated exasperation and declared that he didn't have time to waste on teacher nonsense, while my mother had shrugged and said that Marcus's soccer practice was more important than sitting through some teacher's attempt to make their ordinary daughter feel special. The pattern had continued throughout my childhood. Every achievement dismissed, every accomplishment overshadowed by whatever Marcus happened to be doing at the time. Every attempt to connect with my parents met with cold indifference or outright rejection. When I had won the 6th grade science fair with my project on renewable energy, my parents had missed the ceremony because they were attending Marcus's baseball game, even though his team lost spectacularly and he spent most of the game on the bench. When I had been selected for the honor roll 3 years running, the certificates had disappeared into a drawer without ceremony, while Marcus's participation trophies were displayed prominently on the mantelpiece like sacred relics of parental pride. I had learned to celebrate my victories in silence, to swallow my disappointments without complaint, and to exist in the shadows of a family that seemed determined to erase my presence from their narrative of success and happiness. The isolation had been the worst part, the gradual realization that I was truly alone in a house full of people who shared my DNA, but none of my dreams, hopes, or fears. I had spent countless nights lying in my bed, listening to the sound of my parents laughing with Marcus in the living room below, their voices warm and animated as they discussed his day, his friends, his plans for the future. When I had tried to join these family moments, sliding quietly into the room with homework or a book as an excuse for my presence, the conversation would inevitably die, replaced by an awkward silence that made it clear I was an unwelcome intrusion on their private bond. Over the years, I had stopped trying, retreating to my room with its walls covered in achievements they would never acknowledge and dreams they would never support, building an internal fortress of solitude that would protect me from their indifference, but would also, I was beginning to realize, prepare me for something far more significant than simple survival. Marcus had always been everything I wasn't, confident where I was uncertain, charming where I was awkward, effortlessly successful where I struggled for every small victory. At 23, he possessed that particular combination of good looks and easy charisma that made him the center of attention in any room, his broad shoulders and perfect smile serving as a magnet for both parental adoration and social approval. From the moment he could walk, our parents had treated him like a precious commodity, carefully nurturing every talent, celebrating every minor accomplishment, and smoothing every obstacle from his path with the kind of devotion typically reserved for royalty or religious icons. While I had been left to navigate childhood on my own, Marcus had been surrounded by a protective bubble of unconditional love and support that had shaped him into the golden prince our parents had always envisioned him to be. The contrast between our treatment had been so stark that even strangers noticed it, though they rarely commented directly on the obvious favoritism that colored every family interaction. At restaurants, my parents would engage Marcus in animated conversations about his college experiences, his internship at their friend's law firm, his plans to attend graduate school, while I sat silently cutting my food into smaller and smaller pieces, invisible despite occupying the same table. When relatives visited, they would inevitably ask Marcus about his achievements, his academic honors, his athletic awards, his romantic relationships, while I received polite but dismissive inquiries about school that were clearly obligatory rather than genuine. The message had been consistent and unmistakable. Marcus was the child worthy of attention, investment, and pride, while I was merely an afterthought, a supporting character in the grand narrative of their family success story. But what had hurt the most wasn't Marcus's favored status itself. It was his complete acceptance of the hierarchy that placed him above me in every conceivable way. He had never once questioned why our parents treated us so differently, never expressed concern for the obvious pain their favoritism caused me, never used his privileged position to advocate for basic fairness or kindness toward his younger sister. Instead, he had embraced his role as the golden child with the unconscious entitlement of someone who had never known anything different, taking their lavish attention and support as his natural due while remaining obliviously indifferent to my struggles. When I had tried to talk to him about feeling excluded or ignored, he had brushed off my concerns with casual dismissal, suggesting that I was being too sensitive or making things up, rather than acknowledging the reality of our parents' differential treatment. Tonight, Marcus stood across the room in his expensive suit, his arm draped casually around his latest girlfriend, a stunning blonde named Jessica who worked in marketing and looked at him with the kind of adoring gaze I had once desperately wanted from our parents. He was laughing at something their friend David had said, his head thrown back in that carefree way that spoke of a life unmarred by rejection or disappointment, completely unaware that his presence at my birthday party was yet another reminder of how little this celebration actually had to do with me. As I watched him bask in the attention of the assembled guests, fielding questions about his recent promotion and his plans to propose to Jessica, I felt a familiar mix of longing and resentment wash over me, the eternal contradiction of loving someone whose very existence had overshadowed my own for as long as I could remember. But tonight, I realized with crystalline clarity, Marcus was about to learn that his golden pedestal was built on foundations far more fragile than any of us had ever imagined. The psychological warfare of my childhood had been so subtle, so carefully orchestrated, that for years I had believed the problem lay with me, rather than with the parents who had systematically undermined my sense of self-worth. They had never raised their voices, never laid a hand on me in anger, never done anything that would leave visible marks or obvious evidence of abuse. Instead, they had perfected the art of emotional neglect, wielding silence and indifference like surgical instruments designed to cut away at my confidence without drawing blood. Every birthday that passed without fanfare, every achievement that went unacknowledged, every moment of pain or confusion that was met with dismissive shrugs or irritated sighs, had carved away another piece of my belief in my own value, until I had become convinced that I was inherently unworthy of love or attention. The gaslighting had been particularly insidious, a constant undermining of my perception of reality that had left me questioning my own memories and experiences. When I had complained about feeling left out or ignored, my mother would look at me with that practiced expression of confused concern and insist that I was imagining things, that they loved both their children equally, that I was being ungrateful for all the opportunities they had provided. When I had pointed out specific instances of differential treatment, the way they attended every one of Marcus's games but missed my school plays, the way they celebrated his B+ grades while dismissing my A's as expected rather than praiseworthy, they would reframe these disparities as evidence of their wisdom in treating each child according to their individual needs and abilities. Over time, I had learned to doubt my own perceptions, to accept their version of events over my own lived experience, to internalize the message that my feelings were invalid and my pain was self-inflicted. The isolation had extended beyond my family to every aspect of my social life, as my parents had systematically discouraged friendships and activities that might have provided alternative sources of validation or support. When classmates had invited me to sleepovers or birthday parties, my parents had found reasons to decline. Marcus needed help with homework. There were family obligations that required my presence. The other families weren't quite suitable for someone of our social standing. When teachers had recommended extracurricular activities that aligned with my interests and talents, my parents had dismissed these suggestions as impractical or unnecessary, insisting that my time would be better spent on household chores or academic work that would prepare me for a realistic future, rather than encouraging foolish dreams of artistic or intellectual achievement. Gradually, I had stopped receiving invitations, stopped being included in the social networks that might have provided refuge from the emotional desert of my home life. The financial manipulation had been perhaps the cruelest aspect of their control, a way of ensuring my dependence while simultaneously punishing me for existing. While Marcus had received a generous allowance, a car for his 16th birthday, and full funding for his college education, I had been expected to earn my own money through part-time jobs and academic scholarships, with the understanding that any financial support from my parents came with strings attached and could be withdrawn at their discretion. When I had managed to save money from my job at the bookstore, my parents had found ways to redirect those funds toward family expenses, or emergencies, that somehow never seemed to affect Marcus's spending money or recreational activities. The message had been clear. I was not an investment worth making, not a child worthy of the same financial security and opportunity they provided to their son, but rather a burden whose basic needs were met out of legal obligation, rather than parental love or pride. The final straw had come 3 months ago, on a rain-soaked Tuesday, that had started like any other day, but ended with the complete destruction of my last remaining illusions about my parents' capacity for love or fairness. I had been working at Morrison's Books for over a year, slowly building a reputation among the regular customers as someone who could recommend the perfect novel or help locate obscure academic texts, when Mrs. Morrison had approached me with an opportunity that felt like a gift from the universe itself. She was planning to retire and had been looking for someone to take over the store, someone young and passionate about literature, someone who understood both the business and the customers, someone who could preserve the shop's character while bringing fresh energy to its future. The position came with a modest salary, profit-sharing opportunities, and most importantly, the chance to create something meaningful with my life, to build a career around the thing I loved most in the world. I had rushed home that evening, my heart pounding with excitement and possibility, ready to share the news with my parents and perhaps finally earn their approval and pride. For once, I had something concrete to offer them. Not just good grades or academic achievements they could dismiss as expected, but a real opportunity for independence and success that would reflect well on their parenting and their family's reputation. I had found them in the living room with Marcus, discussing his recent interview for a position at a prestigious consulting firm, their faces animated with the kind of engagement I had dreamed of inspiring my entire life. When I had interrupted their conversation to share my news, explaining Mrs. Morrison's offer and the potential it represented, I had waited for their faces to light up with pride, for congratulations and encouragement, for some acknowledgement that their daughter might actually be capable of achieving something worthwhile. Instead, my father had looked at me with barely concealed disgust and declared that managing a little bookshop was hardly a career worthy of a Blackwood, while my mother had shaken her head with that familiar expression of disappointed resignation and suggested that I clearly lacked the ambition and intelligence to pursue anything more challenging or respectable. They had dismissed Mrs. Morrison as a foolish old woman who was probably trying to take advantage of my naivety, and they had forbidden me from accepting the position, insisting that I should focus on finding a real job, with benefits and security, rather than indulging in romantic fantasies about literary careers. When I had tried to argue, pointing out that this was exactly the kind of opportunity they had always claimed they wanted me to pursue, my father had raised his voice for the first time in years, telling me that I was ungrateful and delusional if I thought running a failing bookstore was an achievement worth celebrating. The conversation had ended with Marcus, of all people, delivering the final blow, a casual comment about how he wasn't surprised I was settling for such limited ambitions, since I had never shown the drive or talent necessary for real success. His words had hit me like a physical punch, not because they were particularly cruel by his standards, but because they revealed the depth of his indifference to my pain and the completeness of his absorption in our parents' narrative about my inadequacy. As I had sat there listening to the three of them discuss my flaws and limitations, as if I weren't even present, something fundamental had shifted inside me. The last vestiges of hope and love that had sustained me through 21 years of neglect had finally crystallized into something harder and far more dangerous. That night, lying in my bed staring at the ceiling, I had begun to plan not just my escape from their toxic influence, but my revenge against the people who had spent my entire life convincing me I was worthless, while simultaneously depending on my silence and complicity to maintain their perfect family facade. The planning had consumed my every waking moment for the past 3 months, an intricate web of research, preparation, and careful calculation that had given me purpose and direction for the first time in my adult life. During my lunch breaks at the bookstore, I had spent hours in the local library, using their computers to dig deeper into my family's history, following digital breadcrumbs that led to financial records, legal documents, and archived newspaper articles that painted a very different picture of the Blackwood family legacy than the one I had grown up believing. What I had discovered had been both shocking and oddly validating, confirmation that the people who had spent my entire life calling me a failure were themselves built on foundations of lies, manipulation, and carefully concealed criminal activity that would destroy their reputation and social standing if it ever came to light. The first breakthrough had come when I had traced my father's business dealings back to his early 20s, discovering a pattern of financial irregularities and questionable partnerships that stretched back decades. Richard Blackwood, the respected businessman and pillar of the community, had built his wealth through a sophisticated network of insurance fraud, tax evasion, and embezzlement that had somehow escaped detection by authorities who were either incompetent or complicit in his crimes. The evidence was scattered across multiple jurisdictions and hidden behind layers of shell companies and forged documents, but the pattern was unmistakable once you knew what to look for. Millions of dollars stolen from insurance companies, government agencies, and private investors, all funneled through accounts bearing false names and fake addresses that could eventually be traced back to my father's control. My mother's secrets had been harder to uncover, requiring a different kind of detective work that led me through medical records, pharmaceutical databases, and professional licensing boards that maintained surprisingly detailed records of misconduct and malpractice. Margaret Blackwood, the devoted wife and caring mother, had lost her nursing license 15 years ago for stealing prescription medications from the hospital where she worked, not for personal use, but for resale to dealers who distributed them to addicts and desperate patients who couldn't afford legitimate medical care. The scandal had been quietly buried through a combination of legal maneuvering and financial pressure, but the evidence remained buried in official records for anyone persistent enough to dig through the bureaucratic maze that protected professional reputations from public scrutiny. But the most devastating discovery had been purely accidental, stumbled upon during a routine search of property records that had led me to a safety deposit box registered under my mother's maiden name in a bank 3 towns away. Getting access to that box had required months of careful planning and the kind of identity manipulation that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. But the contents had exceeded my wildest expectations: photographs, documents, and recorded conversations that revealed the full scope of my parents' criminal enterprise and, more importantly, provided irrefutable proof that Marcus had not only known about their activities, but had been actively involved in laundering money through his supposed internships and academic achievements. The golden child, it turned out, was just as corrupt as his parents, his entire life built on stolen money and fabricated accomplishments that would crumble the moment the truth was exposed to the authorities and the social circle that worshipped the Blackwood family's apparent success and respectability. The moment had arrived with a precision that felt almost ceremonial, as if fate itself had orchestrated this perfect convergence of audience, timing, and opportunity for revelation. I stood up from my chair with deliberate slowness, feeling every eye in the room shift toward me as conversations died and anticipation filled the suddenly quiet space, like electricity before a storm. My parents had finished their performance of parental disappointment, and were now basking in the uncomfortable laughter of their guests, clearly satisfied that they had once again put me in my proper place while entertaining their friends with what they perceived as harmless family humor. But as I reached into my jacket and withdrew the carefully wrapped package I had prepared, I saw my father's expression shift from smug satisfaction to mild curiosity, while my mother tilted her head with that practiced look of maternal tolerance she reserved for my more pathetic attempts at gaining attention. The wrapping paper fell away with a soft whisper that seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed room, revealing a manila envelope thick with documents, photographs, and evidence that represented months of meticulous investigation and preparation. I held it up for everyone to see, my voice steady and clear as I announced that I had indeed brought a gift to my own 21st birthday party, not for myself, as they had assumed, but for them, my beloved parents who had given me so much over the years. The sarcasm in my voice was unmistakable now, cutting through the air like a blade as I began to explain that I had spent considerable time and effort preparing something truly special, something that would finally show everyone present exactly what kind of people Richard and Margaret Blackwood really were, beneath their carefully constructed facade of respectability and success. The first document I pulled from the envelope was a photocopy of a bank statement showing deposits of over $200,000 into an account bearing my father's social security number, but a false name. Deposits that coincided perfectly with insurance claims filed for properties that had burned down under suspicious circumstances over the past 5 years. As I read the account numbers and dates aloud, I watched my father's face drain of color, his confident posture crumbling as he realized the scope of what I had uncovered, and the implications of having this information revealed in front of witnesses who included several of his business associates and social contacts. My mother had begun to shake, her perfectly manicured hands trembling as she reached for her wineglass, with movements that betrayed her growing panic and desperation. But the real shock came when I pulled out the photographs I had found in that safety deposit box. Images of Marcus counting stacks of cash in what appeared to be a warehouse, documents bearing his signature authorizing transfers of funds from accounts linked to his father's fraudulent schemes, and most damning of all, a recording I had made of a phone conversation between my parents and their son, discussing the best ways to hide their criminal proceeds from federal investigators who were supposedly getting too close to their operation. As the truth of their family business became clear to everyone present, I felt a surge of power and vindication, unlike anything I had ever experienced. Finally, after 21 years of being dismissed as worthless and inadequate, I was the one holding the cards, the one with the power to destroy or spare, the one whose words would determine the fate of the people who had spent my entire life, convincing me that I didn't matter at all. The silence that followed my revelations was so complete it felt almost solid, a heavy presence that pressed against every surface in the room, and seemed to muffle even the sound of breathing. I watched as the reality of their exposure sank in, my parents' faces cycling through disbelief, terror, and something that might have been respect if it hadn't been mixed with such obvious hatred for the daughter who had finally found a way to fight back. The guests stood frozen like statues, their wine glasses forgotten in their hands as they processed the magnitude of what they had just learned about the family they thought they knew, their expressions ranging from shock to disgust to a kind of morbid fascination that comes with witnessing the complete destruction of someone's public reputation in real time. Marcus was the first to break the silence, his voice cracking with panic as he lunged forward and demanded to know where I had gotten those documents, how I had accessed their private financial information, whether I understood the consequences of making such serious accusations without proof. But his bluster only served to confirm the authenticity of my evidence, his defensive reaction making it clear to everyone present that he wasn't denying the truth of my claims, but rather trying to minimize the damage of their exposure. I pulled out additional documents methodically, reading account numbers and transaction dates with the precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury, each revelation building upon the last to create an undeniable portrait of systematic criminal activity that had funded their comfortable lifestyle for over 2 decades. My father tried a different approach, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he had always used to silence me in the past, as he declared that I was having some kind of psychological breakdown, that I had clearly fabricated these documents in a desperate attempt to gain attention and hurt the family that had given me everything. But his words rang hollow in the face of the evidence I was presenting, and several of the guests had begun to step away from him as if his criminality might be contagious, their faces reflecting a mixture of revulsion and fear at finding themselves in the same room with someone who was being credibly accused of serious federal crimes. When he threatened to call the police and have me arrested for slander and fraud, I smiled and told him that would be wonderful, since I had already contacted the FBI and provided them with copies of everything I had found, along with detailed testimony about my family's criminal enterprise. The final blow came when I revealed the existence of additional evidence that I hadn't yet shared, recorded conversations, financial records, and testimony from accomplices who had agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for leniency in their own cases. As I spoke, I could see the realization dawning in my parents' eyes that this wasn't a spontaneous act of rebellion, but a carefully orchestrated campaign of investigation and exposure that had been months in the making, that their youngest daughter, the failure they had dismissed and belittled for her entire life, had systematically dismantled their criminal empire while they remained blissfully unaware of the danger she represented. The power dynamic that had defined our family for 21 years had shifted completely and irrevocably, and for the first time in my life, I was the one standing in the light, while they cowered in the shadows of their own making. The aftermath unfolded with the inexorable momentum of a natural disaster, each revelation triggering cascading consequences that would reshape not just my family, but the entire social and professional network that had sustained their criminal enterprise for decades. Within minutes of my presentation, several guests had quietly excused themselves, their faces pale with the knowledge that their association with the Blackwood family could now implicate them in federal crimes if investigators decided to examine their own financial dealings and business relationships. Mrs. Henderson, who had seemed so uncomfortable with my parents' cruel birthday humor just an hour earlier, was now backing toward the door with obvious terror, clearly calculating whether her own questionable tax strategies and undeclared income might attract unwanted scrutiny if she remained connected to this unfolding scandal. My parents' reactions revealed the true nature of their characters in ways that 21 years of careful observation had never fully exposed, stripping away the last vestiges of the facade they had maintained for so long. My father, faced with the complete destruction of his reputation and freedom, turned on me with a viciousness that was startling even by his standards, screaming that I was an ungrateful, vindictive creature who had repaid his generosity and support with betrayal and destruction, that I would never amount to anything without the family name and connections I was now destroying out of spite and jealousy. His words carried no weight now. His authority evaporated in the face of evidence that proved he was nothing more than a common criminal who had used his daughter's invisibility and silence as cover for his crimes, assuming that my compliance and desperation for approval would protect him indefinitely. Marcus, meanwhile, revealed himself to be exactly what I had always suspected, a coward whose golden boy charm evaporated the moment he faced real consequences for his actions. He began pleading with me to reconsider, promising that he would finally treat me as an equal, that our parents would change their behavior, that we could work together to resolve this situation without destroying the family that had given us both so many opportunities and advantages. His desperation was almost pathetic. This grown man who had never faced adversity suddenly reduced to begging his younger sister for mercy while offering concessions that should have been given freely decades earlier. His transformation from arrogant prince to terrified criminal defendant happening so quickly it was almost comical. But it was my mother's reaction that surprised me most, a calm acceptance that bordered on admiration, as she studied my face with new interest, perhaps finally recognizing something of herself in the daughter she had dismissed as weak and insignificant for so many years. She didn't plead or threaten or try to manipulate me with false displays of maternal affection. Instead, she simply nodded slowly and told me that she had underestimated me, that perhaps I was more of a Blackwood than any of them had realized, that my capacity for patience, planning, and ruthless execution was actually quite impressive, even if it was now being used against her. Her words contained something that might have been respect, though it came far too late to repair the damage of 21 years of neglect and contempt. And I realized that this moment of recognition was both everything I had ever wanted from her and completely meaningless now that I no longer needed her approval to validate my worth as a human being. The federal agents arrived exactly 47 minutes after my last guest departed, their timing so precise it was clear they had been waiting for my signal before moving in to make arrests that would send shockwaves through our small town's business and social establishment. I had been expecting them, of course. I had coordinated this entire evening with Agent Sarah Chen, the FBI financial crimes investigator who had been building a case against my father's network for over a year before I had contacted her with my offer of inside information and cooperation. As I watched my parents being read their rights and led away in handcuffs, I felt not the satisfaction of revenge I had anticipated, but rather a profound sense of emptiness, as if the anger and pain that had motivated my actions for so many months had simply evaporated, leaving behind a hollowness that was both liberating and terrifying in its completeness. Mrs. Morrison was waiting for me when I returned to the bookstore the following Monday. Her weathered face creased with concern as she asked if I was ready to discuss taking over the business, now that my family situation had been resolved in such a dramatic and public fashion. The news of my parents' arrests had spread through town with the speed of wildfire, accompanied by rumors and speculation that ranged from accurate to wildly imaginative. But the basic facts were undeniable. The Blackwood family empire had crumbled, their assets were being seized by federal agents, and their youngest daughter had been revealed as the architect of their destruction. Some people viewed me as a hero who had exposed corruption and fraud, while others saw me as a traitor who had destroyed her own family for personal gain. But their opinions mattered far less than they once would have, because I was finally free to define myself by my own standards, rather than their expectations or judgments. The transformation I underwent in the weeks following that birthday celebration was so complete, it felt like being reborn, as if the person I had been for 21 years had been nothing more than a chrysalis designed to protect and nurture the woman I was becoming. Without the constant pressure of seeking approval from people who were constitutionally incapable of providing it, I discovered reserves of confidence and creativity that had been buried beneath decades of self-doubt and conditional existence. The bookstore became my laboratory for self-discovery, a place where I could experiment with ideas, forge genuine connections with customers who appreciated my knowledge and recommendations, and build something meaningful from the ground up, rather than trying to fit myself into someone else's predetermined mold of acceptability. 6 months later, standing in my newly renovated bookstore surrounded by carefully curated collections and comfortable reading nooks that reflected my own vision rather than anyone else's expectations, I finally understood what my parents had been so afraid of all those years. Not that I would fail, but that I would succeed in ways that had nothing to do with their approval or support, that I would become someone whose worth couldn't be measured by their standards or diminished by their neglect. The girl who had stood in that living room enduring their mockery was gone forever, replaced by a woman who had learned that the most powerful form of revenge isn't destruction, but transformation, not becoming what others want you to be, but discovering who you were meant to be all along. As I watched the sunset paint golden light across the spines of books that now belonged to me, I realized that my 21st birthday had indeed been a celebration, not of another year survived, but of the death of one life and the birth of another, infinitely better one, that was entirely and authentically my own. It's been 5 years since that night when I unwrapped the truth and watched my family's carefully constructed world crumble into ash and federal indictments. I'm 26 now, sitting in the back office of what has become the most successful independent bookstore in 3 counties, surrounded by awards from literary organizations and thank you letters from authors whose careers I helped launch through our reading series and book clubs. The woman writing these words bears little resemblance to that broken girl who once believed her parents' assessment of her worth, who spent 21 years apologizing for taking up space in a world that seemed determined to erase her existence. Sometimes I catch my reflection in the window and marvel at the transformation, not just physical, though success and self-respect have certainly changed how I carry myself, but something deeper, a fundamental shift in how I inhabit my own skin and navigate the world around me. The constant anxiety that once plagued my every interaction has been replaced by a quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly who I am and what I'm capable of achieving. My life is no longer defined by what others think I deserve, but by what I choose to create with my own hands, heart, and mind. The bookstore has become more than just a business. It's evolved into a cultural hub that hosts poetry readings, writing workshops, book clubs, and community discussions that draw people from neighboring towns and cities. We've published 3 anthologies of local writers, established a scholarship fund for students pursuing literature degrees, and created a mentorship program that pairs experienced authors with emerging voices who need guidance and encouragement. The irony isn't lost on me that the parents who dismissed my love of books as impractical and worthless inadvertently prepared me for a career that has brought me more satisfaction and recognition than Marcus ever achieved with his supposedly prestigious law degree. Last month, the State Library Association honored me with their Outstanding Contribution to Literary Culture Award, and the governor personally thanked me for my work in promoting literacy and supporting regional authors. The local newspaper, the same one that once featured glowing articles about my father's business success, now regularly covers our events and refers to me as one of the community's most influential cultural leaders, a designation that would have seemed impossible during those dark years when I believed I was destined for mediocrity and disappointment. My relationship with my parents' legacy remains complicated, though I've found peace with the choices I made and their consequences. Richard was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for wire fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion, while Margaret received 8 years for her role in the prescription drug trafficking operation that helped fund their criminal enterprise. Marcus, who cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence, served 2 years in minimum security and now works at a small accounting firm in another state, his dreams of legal greatness permanently derailed by his association with the family business. I receive occasional letters from my father, rambling screeds that alternate between attempts at manipulation and expressions of rage over my betrayal, but I stopped reading them years ago, choosing instead to donate them unopened to the FBI agents who continue to use them as evidence in related cases. The girl who once desperately craved their approval no longer needs their forgiveness or understanding. I've learned that some relationships are so fundamentally toxic that healing isn't possible or even desirable, and that true freedom sometimes requires the courage to walk away from people who will never see your worth. My family now consists of the authors, readers, and community members who have become part of the chosen family I've built around shared values of creativity, authenticity, and mutual respect. The financial aftermath of their arrests led to a complete restructuring of my life that initially felt devastating, but ultimately proved liberating in ways I never anticipated. The family home was seized as part of the asset forfeiture process, along with their cars, investments, and even some of the furniture I had grown up with, leaving me to start over with nothing but my job at the bookstore and a fierce determination to prove that I could build something meaningful from scratch. The insurance money from their crimes was returned to the victims, and I testified at several civil trials where former clients and business partners sought compensation for their losses, experiences that were emotionally draining, but also strangely cathartic. For the first time in my life, I was completely financially independent, free from the web of obligation and manipulation that had kept me tethered to people who saw my dependence as leverage to be exploited, rather than a responsibility to be honored. The apartment I rented above the bookstore was tiny and sparsely furnished, but it was entirely mine, decorated with books I had chosen, artwork from local artists whose work I admired, and photographs of friends and experiences that reflected the person I was becoming, rather than the person I had been told to be. That small space represented more luxury and comfort than the mansion I had grown up in, because it was filled with things I loved rather than things chosen to impress others or maintain appearances. The most unexpected blessing has been the relationships I've formed with people who see and appreciate the real me, rather than the performance of gratitude and compliance I once offered to my family. My closest friend is Elena Rodriguez, a poet who moved here from Chicago to escape her own toxic family situation, and found in our bookstore a place where her work was not just welcomed, but celebrated with the enthusiasm it deserved. We spend hours talking about books, life, dreams, and the peculiar freedom that comes from choosing your own family after growing up in one that never truly accepted you for who you are. The reading group I facilitate has become a tight-knit community of people who come not just for the literary discussions, but for the sense of belonging and understanding that we've created together. Teachers, retirees, college students, and professionals who might never have crossed paths without the books that brought us together. There's something profoundly healing about being surrounded by people who value your thoughts and insights, who celebrate your successes without jealousy or competition, who offer support during difficult times without judgment or conditions. These relationships have taught me what healthy love looks like: freely given, mutually respectful, and based on who you are rather than what you can provide or how well you conform to someone else's expectations of appropriate behavior or achievement. My romantic life has also flourished in ways that would have been impossible when I was still trapped in the cycle of seeking approval from people who were determined to withhold it indefinitely. 2 years ago, I met David Chen, Agent Sarah Chen's younger brother, as it turns out, at a literary festival where he was promoting his first novel, a beautiful meditation on family trauma and the power of storytelling to heal generational wounds. Our connection was immediate and genuine, built on shared experiences of family dysfunction and a mutual commitment to creating better lives than the ones we inherited from parents who saw their children as extensions of themselves, rather than independent individuals worthy of love and respect. David understands the particular kind of courage it takes to expose family secrets when doing so means sacrificing the possibility of reconciliation or forgiveness, and he's never asked me to feel guilty about the choices I made or the consequences my family faces as a result of their own criminal behavior. Our relationship is characterized by the kind of emotional safety and intellectual partnership I never knew was possible: conversations that can last for hours, comfortable silences that feel nurturing rather than awkward, and a shared commitment to supporting each other's dreams and ambitions without competition or resentment. We're planning to marry next spring, in a small ceremony at the bookstore, surrounded by the chosen family of friends and community members who have supported us both through our individual journeys toward healing and happiness. Looking back on that terrible 21st birthday, I can honestly say it was the best thing that ever happened to me, though I couldn't have understood that truth in the moment when everything I thought I knew about my family and myself was being stripped away. The girl who stood in that living room absorbing her parents' cruelty while planning their destruction was operating from a place of justified rage and desperate self-preservation, but she was also unconsciously laying the groundwork for the woman I would become, someone who refuses to accept less than she deserves, who isn't afraid to fight for justice even when it comes at enormous personal cost, who understands that sometimes love means having the courage to walk away from people who will never change. The pain of those early years wasn't meaningless suffering. It was preparation for the strength I would need to rebuild my life according to my own values rather than theirs, to create something beautiful from the ashes of their criminality and neglect. I've learned that resilience isn't about enduring abuse or maintaining relationships that damage your soul, but about recognizing your own worth and refusing to settle for anything less than authentic love and respect from the people you allow into your inner circle. My story isn't one of revenge successfully executed, but of a person finally becoming who she was always meant to be, once the obstacles to her authentic self-expression were removed by her own courage and determination. The bookstore thrives. My community values my contributions. My relationships nourish rather than deplete me. And every morning I wake up grateful for the life I've built, rather than resentful about the one I escaped. That transformation, more than any legal victory or public vindication, represents the truest measure of my success and the most complete repudiation of everything my parents tried to make me believe about my potential and worth.